The morning I understood that something was wrong with my grandson, nobody else was paying attention. That is the part that stays with me. Not the discovery itself, the silence around it. 6 weeks since Aldrich moved his family back into this house, back into Roosevelt's house, back into mine, and the mornings had developed their own rhythm. Aldrich out early. Davina assembled and moving. Tobias, quiet in the way 12-year-old boys are quiet when they are managing something alone. I was on the back porch with my coffee when I saw him through the glass door, sitting at the kitchen island, not watching television, not on his phone, just sitting with a bowl in front of him, eating in the particular stillness of a child whose thoughts are somewhere his body is not. I have raised a son. I know the difference between a boy who is peaceful and a boy who is carrying something. I went inside, sat across from him at the island, didn't ask anything, just sat. He kept eating. We stayed like that for a minute, maybe two, and then it happened. He shifted his left hand off the counter and moved it into his lap. One motion, small, automatic, practiced. The kind of gesture a person develops so early they don't know they're doing it anymore. The burn scar on his left hand has been there since he was 14 months old. I was in Atlanta when it happened. Davina called me, shaking, from the pediatric urgent care. A contact burn, accidental. It healed the way those things heal on babies, which is to say imperfectly, leaving a mark that runs from the base of his fingers across the back of his hand toward his wrist. He has had it his entire conscious life, and sometime between starting at his new school 5 weeks ago and this Saturday morning, he had learned to hide it. I did not react. I sat with him until he finished eating and excused himself, and I watched him go with the same expression I use for everything: steady, open, giving nothing away. Roosevelt taught me that. He used to say the face you show in the moment of discovery is the face that determines what happens next. My name is Charissa Odom. I am 67 years old. I have lived in this Germantown house for 31 years. I buried my husband Roosevelt in the garden he planted, and I raised one son in these rooms, and I know every sound this house makes when something is wrong inside it. Something was wrong. Davina came through the kitchen 20 minutes later, dressed, composed, kissing Aldrich's cheek as he headed to the office, reminding Tobias about his weekend program without breaking stride. The morning ran exactly as it always ran, smooth, efficient. Nobody saw what I had just seen. Or if they saw it, it registered as nothing. A quiet boy eating breakfast, a hand that moved, an ordinary Saturday. I watched their car pull out of the driveway. And I want to ask those of you watching right now, whatever time it is where you are, what time are you joining me today? Because I need you with me for what this morning started. I stood at the kitchen window after they left. The feeling I could not yet name settled into my chest the way Roosevelt's voice used to settle into a room. Quiet, patient, taking up exactly the space it needed. That afternoon, Tobias came home and walked straight past the kitchen without stopping. He had stopped every single afternoon for 6 weeks. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the silences above me, and I knew. Whatever my grandson was carrying up those stairs, it was heavier than a 12-year-old boy should be lifting alone. 6 days I watched that boy move through this house and say nothing. He ate breakfast. He went to his weekend program. He came home and went upstairs. He came down for dinner, answered what was asked of him, and went back up. 6 days of that. 6 days of me watching and waiting and giving him the space to find his own way to the door. Roosevelt used to say, you cannot pull a person toward truth. You make yourself available, and you wait. On the 7th day, Tobias came into the living room, where I was reading, and sat in the chair across from me without being invited. He didn't ask if he could sit. He didn't say anything at all. He just sat, the way people sit when they have finally decided to put something down and need a witness for the putting down of it. I kept my eyes on my book for a moment. Then I closed it. He stared at the television that wasn't on. I watched him work up to whatever he had come in here to do. Then he lifted his left hand and placed it flat on the arm of the chair, palm up, the burn scar fully visible, running from the base of his fingers across the back of his hand toward his wrist. He held it there like he was presenting evidence in a case he had been building alone for a long time. He said, "They call me Scarface at school." Then he pulled his hand back and went back to looking at the blank television. I did not move. I did not reach for him or soften my voice into something that would make him feel like he needed to manage my reaction on top of his own. I asked one question. How long? He said since the third week of school. I did the accounting quietly. 5 weeks. The family had been in Memphis for 6. School started the week after they arrived. 5 weeks he had been walking into that building and carrying this back out of it every single afternoon. 5 weeks of fine at the dinner table. 5 weeks of going straight upstairs. 5 weeks of hiding his hand at the kitchen counter before he even knew I was watching. I asked whether teachers knew. He shrugged one shoulder, small, tired. He said the boy mostly did it between classes or at lunch when teachers weren't standing there. Sometimes other boys repeated it after him because everybody else did. Tobias said once a teacher asked whether something was wrong, and he told her no because he didn't want it getting bigger. That landed exactly where I expected it to. Children trying to survive something quietly will often help the silence continue. He told nobody, not Aldrich, not his mother, me, the grandmother he had known in this daily way for exactly 6 weeks. Something about that moved through me in a way I did not allow to show on my face. I filed it. I would feel it later when I was alone. I asked him one more thing, whether it was one boy leading it or many. He nodded once. One boy. The kind other children follow, because following is easier than standing still. The kind who sets the temperature of a room and watches everyone else adjust to it. I told Tobias to go wash up for dinner. Same voice I always use. He looked at me for just a moment, checking, the way children check the face of the adult they trust, and then he got up and left the room. I sat for a moment after he went, both hands on the arms of the chair. Then my right hand tightened, slowly, deliberately, until the knuckles went pale. I held it. Then I released it. Then I got up and went to start dinner. At the table, Davina asked Tobias how school was going. He said fine. She nodded and went back to her plate without looking up. I watched her do it. I watched her accept that single word from her child and move on. And something settled into my chest that had nothing to do with the bullying and everything to do with what a mother who looked up from her plate would have known 5 weeks ago. I did not sleep that night. I lay in Roosevelt's bed in the dark and ran the shape of it over and over. A boy being broken quietly inside a school his father is paying for. A mother who asked one question at the dinner table and accepted the first word she was given. A grandmother who now knows exactly what that word was covering. I thought about the specific kind of cruelty that finds the thing a child cannot hide and makes it the centerpiece. The scar on Tobias's hand has been there his entire life. He did not choose it. He cannot remove it. And some boy at that school looked at it and saw not a child but an opportunity. That kind of cruelty is not accidental. It is selected. I decided before I fell asleep that I was going to see this boy for myself. The next afternoon, I told Davina I would handle school pickup. She had a late call, and the offer landed without resistance. No questions about why. No curiosity about the change in routine. She said thank you and went back to her laptop, and I went to get my keys. In the pickup line, Tobias came through the school doors, scanned the waiting cars, and found my face behind the wheel instead of his mother's. Something moved across his expression, a loosening, small and involuntary. He got in the back seat, buckled his seatbelt, and looked out the window. He did not ask why I was there. That loosening told me everything about how tired he was of carrying this alone. I let the line move forward 2 car lengths before I spoke. I told him that if he saw the boy, I needed him to point him out. Nothing else. Just point. He went very still in the back seat. He said he didn't want trouble. I told him I was not asking him to do anything except show me. I kept my eyes on the windshield. He kept his on the window. The silence between us had a decision inside it. I could feel him weighing whether he trusted me enough to take even that small step. I did not push. I let the silence do its work. 4 cars ahead, a dark vehicle sat with the driver's door open. A man stood near the front of it, not leaning, not on his phone, just standing, waiting. A boy crossed the pickup area with a backpack on both shoulders and moved toward the passenger side. The man watched the boy get in, checked that the door closed properly, then walked back around to the driver's side. Tobias's breathing changed beside me, tighter, compressed into something smaller than his regular quiet. He said, "That's him. That's Kendrick. That's his dad." I looked at the man, medium height, composed. He had waited until his son was fully settled before he moved. I registered that. A man who checks that his child is secure before he thinks about himself. I filed it alongside everything else and said nothing. I pulled out of the line. Tobias watched my face in the rearview mirror the entire drive home. I know because I could see his eyes. Careful, reading me the way children read the adults they depend on. I gave him nothing to read. Not because I felt nothing, because what I felt had already moved somewhere past feeling and into something quieter and more purposeful. He did not ask what I was thinking. Smart boy. That evening, I found the school directory in the kitchen drawer, where Davina kept the new school paperwork. I ran my finger down the parent contact pages until I found the name Chalice. I copied the address onto a notepad page, folded it once, put it in my cardigan pocket. Then I made myself a cup of tea and went to bed. I did not go the next morning. I gave myself one more day. Not because I was afraid, because I have learned the difference between moving fast and moving right. A woman who arrives hot accomplishes nothing except giving the other person something to manage. I wanted to arrive as myself, fully assembled. Nothing to prove and everything already decided. I ironed my clothes the night before. I was at the Chalice address by 9:30 Saturday morning with his car in the driveway and the kind of quiet on the street that tells you everyone inside is already awake. I rang the bell. He answered inside a minute. A man already moving through his morning. Not assembled, for company, but not caught off guard either. He looked at me the way people look at an unfamiliar face on their doorstep. Pleasant first, then recalibrating, then attentive, the specific attentiveness of a man who has registered that this is not a casual visit. I said, "My name is Charissa Odom. My grandson Tobias goes to school with your son. I need a few minutes of your time." He opened the door wider. That told me something about him before he said a single word. I did not perform anger on that front step. I presented facts. My grandson, his son, 5 weeks. The specific word used, Scarface, repeated, orchestrated, sustained long enough to become the thing my grandson believed other people saw when they looked at him. I watched Warwick Chalice receive each piece of that without flinching away from it. No excuses, no questioning whether it happened. When I finished, he turned back into the house and called Kendrick's name in a voice that expected one thing only, immediate presence. The boy appeared within 30 seconds, 13 years old. He looked at his father, then at me, then at Tobias standing slightly behind me on the step, and he understood enough to know this was not going in his favor. Warwick told him to apologize. Not a general sorry, a specific one. What he said, what it caused, said directly to me with his eyes up. Kendrick did it, fully, without mumbling. Whatever else I might have thought about that morning, the boy did what his father required of him. Then Warwick told Kendrick to look at Tobias properly. Really look at him. He said, "Children decide very early whether another person's pain is entertainment or responsibility, and that he was not raising a son who confused the two." Then Warwick himself crouched down to his son's level to make the point, and that movement brought him close. Close enough that Tobias's left hand, resting on the porch railing, was right there, the burn scar fully visible in the flat morning light, the shape of it unmistakable, running from the base of his fingers toward his wrist, the particular pattern of a contact burn that healed unevenly on skin that had once belonged to a baby. Warwick went still. Not the stillness of a man embarrassed by his son's behavior, something older than that, something that moved through him before he had decided what to do with it. His eyes fixed on the scar, with the concentration of someone reaching backward through years, so quickly it almost looked painful. I watched it happen in real time, the way a person's face changes when recognition arrives without permission. He stood up slowly. The color in his face had not drained, it had simply left, like something behind his eyes had shifted to a different frequency entirely. He was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at Tobias, at the hand on the railing. Then Warwick did something that told me this recognition had not come from nowhere. He asked Tobias quietly how old he had been when the burn happened. Tobias looked at me before answering. I nodded once. Tobias said, "My mom said I was a baby, around one." Warwick closed his eyes briefly at that, 1 second at most, but enough. When his voice came, it was low and deliberate. He said, "I know those scars." I went completely still. Kendrick looked between us, understanding nothing. Tobias looked at me. Warwick reached into his shirt pocket, found a receipt, wrote something on the back, and held it out to me. His hand was steady. "Come see me tonight, please." The please was not a courtesy. It was the word of a man who had been waiting a long time to say what he was about to say. Tobias asked me one question on the drive home. He said, What did that man say to you at the end? The last part. What did he say? I told him Kendrick's father handled it the way a father should, that it was taken care of, that he didn't need to carry it into Monday morning. He nodded slowly and turned back to his window. He did not push for more. That is the particular trust of a child who has learned that the adult beside him moves with intention. That if she is not telling him something, it is not because she is hiding it from him, but because she is handling it for him. 6 weeks, and he already knew that about me. I kept my eyes on the road and my voice level all the way home. Back at the house, I went directly to Roosevelt's study. His books still on the shelves in the order he left them. His reading chair angled toward the window the way he preferred it. The smell of the wood polish the housekeeper uses. The same one Roosevelt specified. The same one I have never changed. I sat in the chair across from his and unfolded the note. A different address from the one I visited this morning, the other side of Memphis. A time, 7 o'clock, nothing else. No explanation, no name signed at the bottom. A man who understands that what matters gets said in person, and what goes on paper should be only what is necessary. I folded it back along its crease and held it. Aldrich called at 5:30. A contract running long, don't hold dinner. I told him it was fine and we hung up. Through the study doorway, I could hear Davina moving through the evening routine, the particular rhythm of it. Table set in the right sequence. Tobias, called down at the right time, the kitchen managed with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has made competence into something close to protection. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. There is something about Davia I have never been able to name correctly. Not coldness, she is warm enough on the surface. Not dishonesty, I have never caught her in a direct lie. Something more like calibration. The way each thing arrives at exactly the right moment, the right tone, the right response. I have registered it at the edge of my attention for 6 years of visits and 6 weeks of daily life, and I have never had a reason to move it closer. I moved it closer tonight. I told her I was going to see an old acquaintance, someone I'd been meaning to catch up with. She said, of course, don't worry about dinner, she would keep a plate warm. The response came without a single question attached to it. No, who is she? No, how do you know her? None of the ordinary texture that naturally appears when people are genuinely woven into each other's lives. Just, of course, easy, frictionless. I said thank you and went to get my coat. I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before I turned the key. I thought about Warwick Chalice's face, about the specific way recognition moves through a person before they have decided what to do with it. I have been reading people for 67 years. What I saw on that man's face this morning was not about his son. It was not embarrassment, and it was not guilt about the bullying. It was memory, not sudden understanding, recognition. The kind that arrives fully formed, because it has been living somewhere inside a person already, waiting for the exact thing capable of waking it back up. A child's hand on a porch railing had done that to him. I started the car. I did not know yet what was waiting for me at that address. I knew I was ready to hear it. The neighborhood was exactly what the man had suggested. Quiet streets, maintained yards, porch lights already on against the early evening dark. Nothing excessive, nothing neglected. The home of someone who builds carefully and maintains what he has. Warwick answered before I finished knocking. He had been watching for my headlights. Inside, he moved to the kitchen without asking whether I wanted to come in. I followed. He put the kettle on and got 2 cups from the cabinet and did all of it with the particular focus of a man who needs something ordinary to do while he locates the beginning of an extraordinary thing. I sat at his kitchen table and waited. He brought the coffee, sat across from me, and placed both hands flat on the table between us, a man steadying himself before weight. He told me about his brother, Deshaun. Younger by 4 years, Atlanta early 2000s. He met a woman through someone they both knew. Not a close friend, an acquaintance. The kind of introduction that feels safe because it comes through a familiar name. Warwick said the timing mattered. This was before people documented every hour of their lives online. Before background searches became something ordinary people knew how to do. Back when a person could still construct an entire version of themselves inside a city and leave very little behind once they disappeared from it. The woman had a baby boy, very young, under 2 years old. She presented herself as a single mother managing alone, dignified despite the difficulty. Deshaun was generous by nature. He was also, Warwick said quietly. The kind of man who believed that a woman carrying that much alone deserved someone who showed up fully. The relationship developed across 8 months. There was talk of a future. There was trust, the kind that gets built slowly through shared meals and small kindnesses, and the particular intimacy of a man who helps raise a child that isn't his. Warwick, said Deshaun, practically lived with them by the end of it. Grocery runs, pediatric appointments, fixing things around the apartment, picking the boy up when he cried. The kind of ordinary domestic details that convince a man he is standing inside something real, because ordinary life is difficult to fake continuously for that long. Then there was money, a business opportunity she brought to him, specific, documented, credible enough that Deshaun agreed to invest. Not millions, not fantasy money. Enough that he borrowed against the small commercial property he owned with a partner and emptied most of what he had in savings besides. Warwick said it was the kind of loss that doesn't make headlines, but absolutely changes the direction of a person's life. Warwick admitted now, years later, that his brother should have slowed down and investigated harder. But he said trust does strange things when it arrives, attached to a child calling you from the next room, and a woman building routines around you every day. By the time the paperwork appeared, Deshaun already believed he knew her. Then the investment produced nothing. Then her phone went to voicemail. Then the voicemail filled up and stopped taking messages. Then she was simply gone. Apartment emptied, lease terminated early, disconnected numbers, back into a life Deshaun never knew existed, leaving him with debt and silence and a humiliation too complete to explain in full to anyone. Warwick said his brother did try to locate her at first, quietly, through the property records connected to the investment and through the mutual acquaintance who introduced them. But the business information turned out to be false. The address trail disappeared quickly, and by the time he understood the full shape of what happened, she had already vanished cleanly enough that even a private investigator produced almost nothing useful. He left the country 2 years later. Warwick said this without drama. He left. He needed distance from everything that period had touched. I asked about the baby. Warwick's hands shifted slightly on the table. He said, Deshaun talked about the boy more than he talked about the woman. The child was what had made it feel real. Not the romance, not the top promise, but the daily weight of a small person who reached for Deshaun and trusted him without reservation. The boy had a burn healing on his left hand when Deshaun first met them. A contact burn, the shape specific enough that Deshaun described it more than once across more than one conversation. Warwick said his brother blamed himself for not being there the day it happened, even though he barely knew them yet. That detail stayed with him because Deshaun carried it like something personal. Warwick had not thought about that detail in years, until this morning, until he crouched on his own front porch. I sat with that for a moment. I understood now why he had given me his address on the back of a receipt. He was not confiding in a stranger carelessly. He was doing the thing that was never done for Deshaun when it mattered. He was giving the truth somewhere to go. He had carried this story for over a decade, watching his brother rebuild from the other side of the world. And this morning, a child's hand on a porch railing had cracked something open that had been shut for all of that time. I set my coffee cup down. I thanked him. My voice was the same as it always is. Inside, I was running the years. Davina's years inside my family, the Atlanta period, Aldrich traveling, the timeline Warwick had just given me. And the years were meeting each other in ways that made me want to be completely still before I moved a single inch. I asked him one question: whether his brother was reachable. Warwick looked at my face for a long moment, reading something in it. Whatever he found there satisfied him. He picked up his phone. Warwick did not call his brother that night. He told me before I left that Deshaun preferred a message first, that he needed to choose when to pick something this heavy back up. Warwick said it without apology. The way a man speaks about a boundary he has learned to respect through understanding what happens when it isn't. I told him I understood completely. I meant it. I drove home through Memphis with both hands on the wheel and nothing on the radio. The Germantown house was quiet when I let myself in. Kitchen light left on. The rest of the house dark and breathing the particular silence of people who have gone to bed without waiting up. I did not go to my room. I went to Roosevelt's study and closed the door behind me. I sat at his desk and I pulled the timeline. Aldrich and Davina married here in Memphis, spring. They moved to Atlanta 2 months after the wedding. Aldrich was expanding the business Roosevelt had spent 30 years building, consolidating the holdings across the Mid-South, and Atlanta was the center of that work. Tobias was born 14 months into the marriage, in Atlanta. Aldrich was traveling through all of it, Memphis to Atlanta and back, sometimes gone for 2 weeks at a stretch, managing contracts, property negotiations, and the particular demands of inheriting a business that was larger than it looked from the outside. I know those years with precision because I lived them from this house. Davina called regularly. Warm calls, the right questions asked about the right things. Nothing that ever gave me reason to look closer. And Aldrich was gone often enough that entire stretches of domestic life belonged mostly to her. I remember that clearly now, too. Atlanta is where this happened. The timeline Warwick gave me. 8 months, early 2000s, a woman with a baby under 2-year-old, laid itself against what I knew of those Atlanta years, and the fit was not approximate. It was exact. The kind of exactness that does not come from coincidence. Tobias's burn was treated at a pediatric clinic in Atlanta when he was 14 months old. I know this because I helped Davina transfer his medical records when they came back to Memphis. Contact burn. Accidental. Consistent with a curious baby and an unsupervised moment. I held that information as exactly what it appeared to be for 12 years. I held it differently now. Davina had presented herself to Deshaun Chalice as a single mother. She had used her own infant son, his presence, his smallness, the realness of caring for him daily, as the instrument that made a fraudulent relationship feel like a genuine life. She had let a man fall in love with a child that was not his to love, and then she had taken his money and walked back into her marriage and never looked behind her. The complete shape of it settled into Roosevelt's study sometime around midnight. I sat with it. I did not cry. Crying was not what this moment required. I pulled the notepad from Roosevelt's desk drawer, and I wrote dates, gaps, what I personally witnessed during those Atlanta years, what Aldrich could confirm from his own travel records, what only Deshaun could confirm from his side of it. I wrote until I had transferred everything from memory onto paper. Then I sat back and looked at what I had assembled. It held together. Every piece of it held. Not perfectly. There were still things only documents could confirm, but enough that the shape of it was no longer speculation. It was structure. I thought about Tobias holding his hand out in the living room, the flatness of his voice when he said it. They call me Scarface. That scar has been on his body since he was 14 months old. He has carried it through every room of his life without knowing what else it was carrying. Warwick's message came at 6 in the morning. I read it in Roosevelt's chair before the house made a single sound. Deshaun will talk to you. Tonight if you're ready. I set the phone on the desk. Outside the window, Roosevelt's garden was just beginning to catch the earliest edge of morning light. I was ready. I spent Sunday the way Roosevelt taught me to spend the days that matter, with the surface completely still. I made breakfast. I asked Tobias about his weekend program and sat with his answer long enough that he knew I was actually listening. I gave Aldrich my opinion on the Hernando property matter he had flagged. He needed someone who remembered what Roosevelt paid for the access easement in 1987, and I was the only person left who did. I told Davina the side yard garden needed attention along the back border. She said she would call the landscaper Monday morning. I performed my own life without a single missed note. That evening, I went to Roosevelt's study at 6:30 and closed the door. Warwick had sent word that Deshaun was available. The video call connected through Warwick's phone, his brother's face appearing on the screen. In the particular flattened light of someone calling from somewhere, the time zone runs differently. Deshaun Chalice was older than I had assembled from Warwick's description. Not old, but marked in the specific way of a man who finished grieving something genuinely difficult and then built a life on the other side of it with deliberate hands. Steady was the word. When Warwick said my name and explained whose grandmother I was, Deshaun went completely still. The silence stretched long enough that I checked the connection. Then he exhaled once and looked directly at the camera. He spoke carefully. He confirmed the city, the timeline, the relationship, the investment, the disappearance, each piece delivered with the precision of a man who has kept an exact internal record of something for over a decade, because accuracy was the only dignity left to him. He described the woman. I listened without moving or interrupting. When he finished, I asked him to describe the baby one more time. He did. The burn on the left hand, the particular shape of it, the way the child reached up with that hand regardless, toward Deshun's face, toward whatever was interesting, toward the world, because a baby 14 months old does not yet know to protect the place that was hurt. He said the boy had a name, Davina, used consistently across all 8 months, casually. The way you use a name that belongs to someone, Marcus. I kept my face entirely still. I told him the child's name was Tobias, that he was 12 years old, that he lived in this house in Memphis, that I was his paternal grandmother, and I had watched him hide that hand at a kitchen counter 6 weeks ago on a Saturday morning. Deshun looked away from the camera. Not dramatically, the small, private movement of a man receiving something he did not know he needed. When he looked back, his voice was very quiet. He said, "She didn't even use his real name." I said, "No, she didn't." That landed in Roosevelt's study like something being set down after a very long carry. He told me about the records then. Not an archive, but enough. Bank statements from the period. Messages she sent him. A document she provided for the investment that he had authenticated as fraudulent through a lawyer who owed him a professional courtesy. He had kept all of it, not obsessively, carefully, because releasing the last proof felt too much like agreeing that he had imagined the whole thing. I told him I would be in touch very soon. I told him this conversation stayed between the three of us until I said otherwise. He agreed without conditions. Before I closed the call, he said one thing. I never thought I'd know what happened to that little boy. I closed the laptop. The study went dark around me. Outside the door, the house moved through its evening sounds. Familiar, ordinary, unchanged. I did not move for a long time. I slept well for the first time since Saturday morning. That surprised me until I understood it. Suspicion has no shape. It moves through you without finding anywhere to settle, which means you carry it everywhere without being able to put it down. Certainty is different. Certainty has edges. You can set it on a desk and look at it and know exactly what you are working with. I had been exhausted by not knowing what I was holding. Now I knew. And knowing, even when what you know is devastating, is always lighter than suspecting. I did not contact anyone connected to the Odom name, not a family attorney, not anyone who had ever sat in Roosevelt's office or attended one of his business dinners or knew Aldrich by his first name from prior dealings. I spent Monday morning researching independently, and by noon I had identified a civil litigation attorney in Memphis with a documented record in financial fraud cases, a woman. I called her office and requested a consultation. In that first call, I gave her nothing identifying. No names, no family, no connection to the Odom business. I described the situation in framework only. A fraud committed in Atlanta in the early 2000s. A victim who still retained records, and a financial loss large enough that it changed the direction of his life. I asked whether any civil exposure could realistically still exist after this much time. Her answer was careful and it was specific. She said old fraud cases are difficult. Records disappear. Filing periods matter. Witnesses relocate, memories shift, institutions merge or close. She said most matters that old never move anywhere meaningful at all. But she also said concealment changes things sometimes, particularly if the injured party could not reasonably have discovered the full nature of the deception at the time it occurred. She was very clear that no attorney promises viability over the phone, especially on a matter more than a decade old. She said criminal exposure and civil exposure were two completely different questions, and that what survives legally often depends less on outrage and more on documentation, corroboration, and provable timelines. Then she asked whether the victim had only recently learned information that materially changed his understanding of what happened. I said yes. She said that mattered. I made an appointment for the following morning. I brought 3 things to that meeting. The written timeline I had assembled in Roosevelt's study, the dates I personally could confirm from those Atlanta years, and Warwick's name and contact information as the corroborating family witness. I did not bring Deshun's documentation. Those records belonged to him. I would not move them without his explicit agreement. The attorney asked how many people currently held this information. I told her 3, including myself. She said to keep it exactly there until we understood the full scope. I told her I already had. Then she said something I had considered only in part. She said Davina's current position inside a family with active business holdings and substantial assets in Memphis was legally material. Not because marriage protected her automatically, and not because every asset would somehow become reachable overnight. She was careful about that distinction, but because stable residency, identifiable financial connections, and documented access to resources changed the practical realities of pursuing a civil matter across state lines. A judgment against a person with no stable assets and no traceable financial structure is often expensive to pursue and difficult to enforce in meaningful ways. Davina no longer lived that kind of life. The attorney said something else then, quietly, more observation than legal opinion. She said people who believe they escape consequences often stop organizing their lives like people preparing to disappear. I sat with that all the way back to Germantown. She had spent 12 years believing she had married into safety. Instead, she had married into the precise infrastructure that made her visible, reachable, and answerable in ways she had never been before. I drove home from that meeting, understanding exactly what I was carrying. This was no longer moving toward a private family confrontation. Not yet. It was moving toward legal review, documented exposure, and decisions that would need to be made carefully if they were going to hold up under scrutiny. I pulled into the Germantown driveway and sat in the car. Through the front window, I could see Davina moving through the living room, unhurried, composed, completely unaware that the ground she was standing on had already shifted beneath her feet. I watched her for exactly as long as I needed to complete the thought. Then I got out of the car and went inside to have dinner with my family. One thing remained before I brought this to my son. I needed to know whether Deshaun would participate in civil proceedings if it came to that. Not because I doubted him, but because I would not place something in Aldrich's hands without knowing it was solid all the way through. A weapon with conditions attached is not a weapon. It is a liability, I called Warwick. Warwick reached his brother. The answer came back within the hour. Yes, no conditions, no qualifications, yes. I requested the documentation through Warwick that same afternoon. The authenticated fraud instrument and the bank records Deshaun had described on the call. He sent everything digitally before the day was out. I printed it all in Roosevelt's study, laid it on the desk alongside my written timeline and the attorney's preliminary assessment from our meeting. I looked at what I had assembled. Then I closed the folder. Aldrich called at 7 that evening. Contract negotiation running long. Don't hold dinner. I told him to come see me when he got home regardless of the hour. There was a pause on his end, not long, 2 or 3 seconds, but I know my son's silences the way I know the sounds of this house. He heard something in my eyes, not alarm, not urgency. Wait. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it would be. He arrived at 11. The house was completely quiet. Davina had gone to bed 2 hours earlier. I was in Roosevelt's study with the lamp on. I put him in his father's chair. The one Roosevelt used for every serious conversation Aldrich had ever watched from the doorway as a boy, standing in the hall in his pajamas, listening to the low register of adult things being settled. He knew what that chair meant. He sat in it without being asked twice. I placed the folder on the desk between us. I told him I needed him to hear everything before he spoke. He looked at the folder, then at my face. Then he nodded. I told him all of it. From the beginning. Tobias, the bullying, the school pickup, Warwick Chalice on his front step, the recognition, the Saturday evening meeting, Deshaun's account, the video call, the name Marcus, the authentication, the attorney, the legal assessment sitting in that folder on his father's desk. I laid every piece in sequence, completely, without editorializing a single moment of it. I watched his face receive it. The denial arrived first. Brief, involuntary, a single moment where his expression refused what I was saying before his intelligence opened the door and let it through. Then he shook his head once. Not at me, at the desk, at the years themselves. He asked whether I was certain the child Deshaun described was Tobias. I told him about the burn, the timing, the false name, the records, the Atlanta dates. Warwick's confirmation. Deshaun identifying the scar before he knew anything else about the boy standing on that porch. Aldrich leaned back in Roosevelt's chair and covered his mouth with his hand for a moment. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder. Then he ran his own memory against mine. I could see it happening. The Atlanta years, the travel schedule, the calls he made from hotel rooms while Davina was home, and I could see the places where his memory confirmed everything without wanting to. The quiet that came after that was the one I had been bracing for since Saturday. Deep and still, and far more controlled than anything loud would have been. He reached for the folder, opened it, read every page with his right hand pressed flat on the desk beside it. The way a person presses against something solid when the ground beneath them is no longer reliable. Halfway through the bank records, he stopped reading. Not long. Just long enough to stare at one page without moving, while something inside him recalculated itself around a reality it had not prepared for. Then he continued. He read to the last page, closed the folder, his hand relaxed. He looked at me and asked one question. How long have you known? I told him exactly. Every step, every day, every decision I made about sequencing and why. He nodded once. He stood up and kissed me on the forehead. Something he had not done since he was young enough that Roosevelt was still alive to see it. Then he walked out of the study and down the hall. Not to the room he shares with Davina, the room down the hall. His own room. I sat in Roosevelt's study and listened to the door close. The 3 days that followed were the strangest I have spent inside this house. Aldrich moved through his routines with a precision that would have looked completely normal to anyone who had not spent 46 years learning his face. He spoke to Davina at breakfast. He went to the office at his regular time. He came home, ate dinner at the table, asked Tobias about his week, every surface thing in its correct position. But underneath it, if you knew where to look, Aldrich was operating differently. Methodical, unhurried, moving pieces I could not fully see from where I was standing. I found out through my attorney that he had called her office himself the morning after our conversation in the study. He had engaged his own counsel separately, and the two attorneys were now working in coordination. He had not told me he was going to do this. He did not need to. I brought him the truth, and what he built from it belonged entirely to him. I did not interfere with a single thing he was constructing. That is what it looks like when a careful man decides to verify the full shape of something before emotion gets near it. Davina began to feel it by the second day. I watched it happen with the particular attention of a woman who has been watching this person for 6 years and now understands what she was always seeing. The attentiveness toward Aldrich increased in small, measurable ways. Questions with slightly more presence behind them. A watchfulness that appeared in her eyes when his back was turned. The way she tracked his movements through the house without appearing to track anything. A woman who built a careful life over a buried thing develops a sensitivity to atmospheric pressure that most people never need. Her instincts were waking up. She could feel that something had shifted. She could not identify what or where. She said nothing to me. I said nothing to her. On the third morning, Tobias sat down at the kitchen island and told me that Kendrick had spoken to him at school the previous afternoon. Not to continue anything, to apologize again. Privately, without an audience, away from the other children. Tobias described it with the careful uncertainty of a boy who wants to believe something, but has been hurt enough to check before he does. I told him it meant the other boy was being raised correctly. I meant every word of it. Whatever was happening between the adults in this situation, Warwick Chalice was handling his son with exactly the kind of consistency that earns a child's character over time. I filed that with genuine respect, and I set it aside. That evening I sat on the back porch after dinner, the same chair, Roosevelt's garden running along the same lines it always has, needing cutting along the back edge the way it needs cutting every year at this time. The early dark settling over the yard, the same way it settled the morning I sat here, and saw Tobias through the glass door with his hand hidden in his lap. The house behind me, the same house. The sounds inside it, the same sounds. Everything on the surface identical. Everything underneath permanently changed. I thought about Roosevelt. About what he would say if he could sit in the other chair and look at what this family had been carrying without knowing it. I think he would have been quiet for a long time first. And then I think he would have looked at me and said, "You did right by this family, Charissa. You did right." I held that thought until I heard the back door open. Aldrich stood in the doorway. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said one word. Just that. Nothing else. I nodded. He went back inside. I turned back to Roosevelt's garden and the dark, and I sat with Tomorrow until it was time to sleep. I was already awake when the house began to move. Aldrich was up before 6. I heard him go into his study, the door closing with the particular click of a man who needs the room sealed before he begins. His voice came through low and measured, the cadence of someone on a call that requires precision rather than volume. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the cup. I am very good at waiting, Roosevelt made sure of that. By mid-morning, I understood what those 3 days had contained. Aldrich's attorney had walked him through the steps that high-asset situations require before any confrontation occurs. Account access reviewed, business signing authority examined, statutory authorization changes put in place where appropriate, shared financial exposure, mapped carefully before anything emotional turned the situation chaotic. My attorney had explained this framework to me in our meeting, not dramatic restructures done overnight. Protective positioning, the quiet legal work people with serious holdings do before conflict becomes public and every decision starts carrying risk. Aldrich had not needed the explanation. Roosevelt's son understood the geometry of protecting what his father built without being told how that geometry worked. He had spent 3 days doing it quietly and thoroughly. Davina came to the kitchen for lunch, and I watched her move through the meal with the watchfulness of a woman whose instincts have fully surfaced. The questions she put to Aldrich were a degree more present than usual. Not suspicious on their face, but probing at the edges of things. The way she tracked him when his back was turned had a quality to it now that was different from attentiveness. It was the specific vigilance of a person who has felt this particular atmospheric pressure before and knows what it has historically meant. In Atlanta, when things were ending, when the only move available was the exit, those instincts had kept her safe before. They were firing now, and she had nothing to aim them at because she did not yet know what had shifted or how completely. After lunch, Aldrich set his napkin on the table and said he needed Davina to come to Roosevelt's study. Then he looked at me and said he needed me there as well. Davina looked at me when he said that. 1 second. No longer. But in that 1 second, something moved across her face that had nothing to do with the composed woman she had spent 6 years presenting to this family. Something that recognized, without evidence, on pure instinct, that I was not a bystander in whatever was about to happen in that room. That I was the reason there was a room to walk into at all. Then she smoothed her expression back into place and said, of course. The 3 of us arranged ourselves in Roosevelt's study the way the room required. Aldrich behind his father's desk. The desk where every serious Oldham family matter had been settled since Roosevelt first put it there. I sat in the chair by the window. Davina on the small sofa across from the desk, sitting with the particular uprightness of a woman performing composure at the highest level she is capable of sustaining. Aldrich opened the folder. He turned the first page toward Davina without a word. He watched her face. She looked down at the document, the authenticated fraud instrument, her own construction, the paperwork she had assembled in Atlanta over a decade ago to give a fabricated investment the appearance of legitimacy. The document a man had kept for 12 years because releasing it felt too much like releasing the proof that it happened at all. It was sitting on Roosevelt Odom's desk, in the house she had lived in as a member of this family. Davina did not speak. She did not move. The color in her face did not drain. It simply ceased. The way motion ceases in something that has been running continuously for a very long time and has finally, completely, run out of road. The silence held long enough that I could hear the house around us. The refrigerator cycling in the kitchen. A car moving slowly on the street outside. Tobias upstairs in his room. The particular overhead creak of a 12-year-old moving between his desk and his bed, living his afternoon without knowing what was happening 2 floors below him. Then Davina spoke. Not a denial, not shock performed for the room. A question, delivered in a voice I had never heard from her before, stripped of its construction, quieter than anything she had said in 6 years of knowing me. She said, "How did you find out?" Aldrich told her. From the beginning. Tobias, the bullying, the school pickup, Warwick Chalice on his front step, the recognition, the Saturday evening, Deshun's account, the video call, the name Marcus, the documentation, the attorneys. He laid every piece in the same sequence I had laid it for him, completely without editorializing a single moment. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. He spoke the way Roosevelt spoke, when a thing needed to be said fully and only once. Davina listened to all of it without interrupting. Her face did something complicated during the section about Deshun. Not guilt. Guilt has a sharper edge than what I saw. This was something older and more exhausted than guilt. The specific expression of a person, hearing the complete shape of a debt they have carried so long, they had almost stopped remembering what it originally looked like. When Aldrich said the name Marcus, something finally slipped, not dramatically. A breath, sharp enough to hear in the quiet room. Her hand moved against the sofa cushion beside her, like she needed to steady herself against something suddenly uneven beneath her feet. For 1 second, her eyes closed. That was the first fully unguarded thing I had seen from her in 6 years. When Aldrich finished, she began. Not everything at once. In pieces. The way admission actually works when a person is cornered by evidence rather than conscience. She confirmed what she could not deny. She was in a difficult situation during those Atlanta years. She was alone more than she was not. She made decisions she had not made before and has not made since. She is not the person who did those things. Then, for the first time since sitting down in Roosevelt's study, her voice broke. Small, brief, but real. She said she never thought any of it would follow her here. The room went completely still after that. Aldrich looked down at the folder for a moment before answering. Not long, but long enough that I watched him press his thumb once against the edge of the paper, hard to bend slightly before letting it go again. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed level. He told her the civil case was already in motion. Deshun had formally engaged counsel. He told her his own attorney would be in contact regarding the marriage. He told her the financial arrangements she had been living within had been restructured through proper legal process before this conversation began. Each piece in the same even voice he uses for business matters. Because that was what this was now. Davina looked at me, a long look, moving through several things before it found where to settle. I understood what she was looking for. Some signal that softness existed somewhere in this room, that the woman who had sat across from her at this family's table for 6 years held something she could reach toward. I held her gaze, and I gave her nothing except my flinching. Then her chin lifted, the composure reflex, so practiced it arrived without being chosen. But this time it didn't hold. Her jaw tightened against something. Her eyes went bright with the specific brightness of a person working very hard, not to break it in front of the people who would see it. One breath. Then the composure came back together. But it had shown its material. Just once. Just long enough. She stood. Straightened her clothes. That gesture I have watched 100 times across 6 years and now understood completely. She walked to the study door. At the frame she paused, hand on the wood, not turning. One beat of stillness. Then she said something so quietly I almost missed it. She said, I did love him. Both of them. I could not tell whether she meant Deshun and Aldrich, or Aldrich and Tobias. Then she went. 3 doors closed behind her in sequence. The study, the hallway, the bedroom. Each one a different sound. Each one a different kind of ending. I had expected consequence to feel like something. A shift in the air. A visible collapse. Some external confirmation that the weight of what had been uncovered was registering on the surface of things. What I got instead was procedure. Quiet, thorough, relentless procedure. The kind that does not announce itself and does not pause and does not care how anyone feels about its pace. Drama ends. Procedure continues until everything is resolved. The civil case moved forward through the week with the momentum of something that had been properly built. Deshun's attorney coordinating with my Memphis contact, filings made in the appropriate jurisdiction. Davina's current financial position, making the matter substantially easier to pursue than it would have been 12 years earlier. The documentation Deshun had kept for all those years, the bank statements, the authenticated fraud instrument, the messages, turned out to be precisely what a properly prepared civil review required. A man who held on to proof, because releasing it felt like losing the only evidence the thing actually happened, had, without knowing it, preserved the structure necessary for someone to finally examine it seriously. Within the week, Davina retained her own counsel. Within the week, temporary separation arrangements were being discussed through attorneys instead of inside the house itself. By Thursday, she had agreed to stay elsewhere while everything moved through the proper channels. There was no scene, no farewell, no final exchange in the hallway or the kitchen or at the bottom of the stairs. On a Thursday afternoon, Tobias came home from school, and his mother was not in the house. The house simply had one fewer person in it. That was all. Tobias noticed. Not the legal proceedings. He had no knowledge of those. The atmospheric change. The particular quality of a house that has had someone carefully removed from its center, rather than someone who simply stepped out for the afternoon. He was quieter than usual across the first few days. He ate his afternoon snack at the kitchen island and went upstairs and came back down for dinner and said what needed to be said and went back up. But he still stopped in the kitchen every afternoon. He still came and sat near me in the evenings without being invited. That told me what I needed to know about how he was going to come through this. A boy who still reaches for the person he trusts is a boy who is going to be all right. I held that and I did not let go of it. Warwick called midweek. He said it plainly. The way he says most things, Deshaun was coming back to Memphis. Not permanently, but he was coming. He had not been back to this city since he left it over a decade ago. Since he packed what he could carry and put distance between himself and everything that period had touched. Warwick said it simply, and I heard every layer underneath the simplicity. A man returning to the city he had to leave is not a logistical event. It is a decision made in the part of a person where the real accounting happens. I told Warwick I was glad. I meant it with everything I had. That evening I sat on the back porch and let myself think about the chain of it for the first time, without needing to be strategic about anything. A boy who hid his hand at a kitchen counter. A grandmother who noticed. A Saturday morning confrontation that was supposed to be about a bully and became something else entirely when a man crouched down on his own front step. No plan behind any of it. No investigation. No deliberate pursuit of what was buried. Just truth moving the way truth moves when it has been held under long enough. It finds a surface. It always does. Warwick said Deshaun landed in 2 days. He asked if I would be willing to meet him. I said yes before he finished the question. I hung up and went to Roosevelt's study and sat with the lamp on and the house quiet around me. Almost, I thought. Almost there. Deshaun Chalice was taller than I expected. I don't know why I expected anything specific. I had only ever seen him on a small screen in a dark room, flattened by distance and poor light. He stood in Warwick's living room, and when I came through the door, he extended his hand, then reconsidered, and I stepped forward and we did something that was neither a hug nor a handshake. The particular physical grammar of two people who survived something together without ever occupying the same room. There is no other name for what that feels like. Warwick brought coffee and then found somewhere else to be. A man who knows when a room belongs to other people. Deshaun and I sat across from each other and talked for a long time. He told me about the Atlanta years from his side of them, what the rebuilding looked like, the country he had made into a life, the specific work of becoming someone stable on the other side of something that had taken everything he had built. I listened the way I have listened to everything across these weeks, completely, without moving him toward the part I wanted to hear before he was ready to get there. Then he asked about Tobias. Not about Davina. Not about the civil case or the outcome or the marriage. About the boy. I told him. The bullying, the new school, the 5 weeks Tobias carried it without telling a single adult. How he finally came into the living room and sat across from me and laid his left hand flat on the arm of the chair like he was presenting evidence in a case he had been building alone. Deshaun listened, with an expression I could not fully name. Something between grief and tenderness. The specific feeling of learning that something innocent you were briefly connected to had its own weight you never knew about and could not have helped carry even if you had. I told him, he led me straight to you, and he doesn't even know it. A 12-year-old boy hiding a scar at a kitchen counter on a Saturday morning. That was where the whole thing started. Nothing more deliberate than that. She sat with it for a moment. Then he said, I spent 12 years believing I would carry this unfinished for the rest of my life. That boy closed it. He wasn't trying to do anything except get through his morning, and he closed it. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The quiet between us was the comfortable kind. The kind that has earned its own stillness and doesn't need anything added to it. Aldrich made Deshaun whole before the week was out. Not through the civil proceedings. That process continued through proper legal channels on its own track. Privately, directly, through the coordination of both their attorneys, Aldrich made full restitution of what had been taken. not because a judgment required it, because the Odom name had provided the shelter inside which the woman who dismantled Deshun's early life had lived protected for over a decade. Roosevelt's son does not sit with a debt like that. He settles it. Deshun accepted it the way a man accepts something he had stopped believing would ever come. Carefully, quietly, with the full dignity of someone who had rebuilt himself without it and was now being asked to receive it anyway. That evening, I sat on the back porch. Roosevelt's garden running along its usual lines, needing cutting at the back edge the way it always does. The Memphis evening light doing what it does in this season. Taking its time, going slowly, as if it understands there is no reason to rush. Tobias came outside and dropped into the chair beside me, the way boys his age inhabit furniture. Sudden, total, completely without ceremony. He didn't look up from his phone. He just said, "Is everything okay now, Grandma?" I looked at him, at his left hand resting on the arm of the chair, the scar visible in the evening light, easy and uncovered, not tucked into his lap, not hidden from anything. I said, "Yes, it's handled." He nodded once and went back to his phone. Went back to being 12 years old. Went back to the ordinary business of a boy who does not yet know how much his grandmother did on his behalf, or how far the truth traveled to find its way back to the surface. I sat with Roosevelt's garden and the fading light, and I thought about how a thing that started with a child hiding his hand at a kitchen counter ended with a man on the other side of the world finally being found. Roosevelt always said the truth doesn't hurry. It just never stops moving.